A P-38 Lightning had been sitting under 268 feet of solid Greenland ice for 50 years. And in 1992, a team of engineers actually tried to get it back. Not for a museum, not for a research project, but because this team believed that airplane should finish the mission it never got to complete. No one knew if they could pull it off, or if trying would destroy the only thing they were trying to save. Before Lieutenant Harry Smith walked away from his P-38 on the Greenland ice cap, he did something that made no sense at all. He took the keys to his canopy and threw them inside the cockpit. He knew he wasn't coming back. He knew the plane was finished. And still, he left the keys. 50 years later, someone built a thermal drill and lowered men into a glacier to find out why.
You see, most people tell this as a recovery story. Something was lost, something was found, and it is that. But I think there's something more interesting happening here, because this story isn't just about an airplane. It's about the specific human impulse we all have, that almost irrational impulse to find something that was lost, to refuse to accept that a machine built to fight overseas, which never even made it across the Atlantic, should just disappear into the ice forever. That impulse drove 12 failed expeditions before anyone even got close to finding this plane.
July 15th, 1942. Operation Bolero. The Atlantic Air Bridge. The mission to ferry American aircraft from the United States to England as fast as possible. And that decision would strand dozens of aircraft in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Flying across Greenland wasn't just difficult. It was dangerous in ways pilots definitely weren't prepared for. The navigation was primitive. Weather forecasts were unreliable. And the ice cap created sudden storms, whiteouts, and violent winds that could appear without warning. Pilots who encountered trouble often had only one option, which was to land on the ice. Now, in many cases, they did so successfully. The crews survived. Some were rescued days or weeks later. On July 15th, 1942, a group of 6 P-38 Lightning fighter planes from the 94th Squadron, along with 2 B-17 bombers, were being flown to England to fight in the war. Low on fuel and disoriented in the weather, the pilots made the decision that no pilot ever wants to make. They were going to put down on the ice cap. Brad McManus went first. He was the lowest on fuel. And because he was 23 years old and still believed he could save everything, he came in with his wheels down. The nose gear, of course, collapsed, and the airplane flipped. The remaining P-38s all bellied in. The 2 B-17s circled for another hour, sending distress signals before they too came down. Homer Henry, a gunner on the B-17 Big Stoop, which was escorting the P-38s to Europe, had a camera with one roll of film. The 25 men huddled inside the bombers for 9 days, until a rescue team arrived by dog sled. They then marched 10 miles to the southeast coast. There, a Coast Guard cutter took them home. Before Lieutenant Harry Smith walked away from his P-38, he did something small. He took the keys to his canopy and threw them inside the cockpit.
I mean, let's look at that. He was leaving his airplane in the middle of a glacier on Greenland. He knew it was over. And still, he left the keys. Now, that detail is going to matter later.
These planes stayed on the surface for a while. And then Greenland did what Greenland does. The ice cap accumulates 3 to 5 feet of snow every single year. The snow compresses into ice, and that ice moves. And anything sitting on top of it gets swallowed. By the 1970s, nobody could precisely locate the aircraft. By the 1980s, when the first serious search expedition arrived with ground-penetrating equipment, instruments placed the planes somewhere between 250 and 280 feet below the surface. The depth was later identified more accurately. I'm talking about under 268 feet of solid glacial ice. Not simply buried, encased in ice. Two Atlanta businessmen, Pat Epps and Richard Taylor, became obsessed with what later became known as the Lost Squadron in the late 1970s. They launched their first expedition in 1983. They came back again. By the time Roy Shoffner entered the picture, a Cold War Air Force veteran, a Kentucky businessman, Epps and Taylor's team had mounted 12 unsuccessful expeditions. A decade of searching, and still they hadn't touched an airplane. Shoffner had the resources to try something no one had tried before.
Because once you locate a P-38 under 260 feet of ice, you no longer have a search problem. Now you have an engineering problem. After all, how do you carve a tunnel into a glacier?
They built a device called the Super Gopher, a thermal meltdown generator. 4 feet wide, it melts ice by circulating hot water through copper tubing coiled around its outside. You suspend it over the drill site from a hoist and you lower it, slowly, at a rate of about 2 feet per hour. The math on that is not encouraging. 2 feet per hour, 268 feet. The shaft alone took the better part of a month to complete. When the Gopher finally reached the bottom, they winched it back to the surface. And then the real work started. Men were lowered down the shaft, equipped with steam hoses. A 25-minute descent. One of the expedition team members, wwII Smith, later described it this way.
The first time when I went down in the hole, it was 48 inches in diameter, and you can stick your arms out. It's that small of a hole. You're going down to a plane and smelling the stench of varnish from the gasoline. It makes you think twice when you're down there.
Their job was to carve a working cave around the aircraft. They worked in a constant rain of melting water and chunks of ice dropping from above. Periodically, a chisel strike would send cracks running through the ceiling of the ice cavern like bolts of lightning. I'm talking about carving a workspace inside a chamber that the glacier was actively trying to close around them.
Where you're going and what you're doing is way too dangerous. You know, especially the Glacier Girl. You want to trust everybody you're in the hole with. We're 268 feet down in the ice. If you can't trust the guy next to you, you shouldn't be there. He shouldn't be there.
Once the cave was complete, the disassembly began. First the propellers, then wings, fuselage sections. Every part logged. Every part hoisted 268 feet to the surface. The last piece was the center section, 17 feet by 21 feet, 7,000 pounds, 3.5 tons. They moved it with a manually operated hoist. 4 cranks for every 1/4 inch of rise. 1 person at a time, cranking. 7,000 pounds, 268 feet. It took almost 2 full days to bring it up. The full recovery took 4 months.
Here's the detail I keep coming back to. The day the last section of the aircraft reached the surface, the day the team stood on the Greenland ice cap, surrounded by the pieces of the P-38 that hadn't seen daylight in 50 years. That day was July 15th, 1992. Think about that. Exactly 50 years to the day from the crash landing.
And standing on that ice was Brad McManus, the pilot whose nose gear had collapsed in 1942, who was 23 years old when he walked away from his airplane. The pieces were airlifted to a seaport, loaded onto a Danish ship, transported to Savannah, Georgia, and driven to Roy Shoffner's hangar in Middlesboro, Kentucky. The restoration took years. The 1,275 horsepower Allison engines were rebuilt from scratch. And then one day, they turned over. She flew again. And that's the part of the story we rarely talk about. We call this a recovery story. The airplane was lost, and then the airplane was found. But the reason this particular recovery happened, the reason 12 failed expeditions and a decade of setbacks didn't stop anyone, was those keys. Harry Smith threw the keys inside the cockpit before he walked away. And somewhere in that small gesture, that instinctive act of a 23-year-old pilot who knew he was leaving forever, it's the entire explanation for why, 50 years later, someone spent a 6-figure budget building a thermal drill and lowered men into a glacier. The airplane had a mission it never finished. And the unintended result is that some of the most extraordinary feats of human obsession and engineering in the post-war era exist only because someone, decades later, refused to accept that as the ending. Because once you leave the keys inside the cockpit, the story is never quite over.
And that's the beauty of it, because the story of the Lost Squadron, it combines everything that fascinates us. Iconic World War II planes, a forced landing, and tale of Arctic survival. Throw in the search for and discovery of an untouched aircraft wreck years later. And then finally, you got to add the recovery of that airplane. Now, if you want more stories like this one, the ones that history books leave out, then I hope you'll consider subscribing and staying right here, because we got a lot more of them.